As our church undertook the study of the book of James, one of the things we decided to do was take some of this deep dive background material and set it aside in a small series of videos on the life of James, the leadership of James in the Jerusalem church, and then the letter itself, its date and its immediate circumstances. We hope this will further enlighten and enable you to participate well in our Sunday morning sermon series on the book of James. Welcome to the first of our background videos on the book of James. I've divided the material for this background study into three broad topics: the life of James, the leadership of James in the Jerusalem church, and then finally the letter of James. First, let's talk about the life of James. Who wrote the book of James? Really, there are only two truly possible candidates. And I think I can show you that of those two possible candidates, really only one possible candidate. One possible candidate is the Apostle James. James, the brother of John. No one suggests that the other Apostle James, the barely mentioned James the son of Alphaeus, he really only shows up in the Gospels in list of names. But there is a prominent Apostle James, James the brother of John, James and John the sons of Zebedee. But it's unlikely that he wrote the book of James, largely because we know from the book of Acts chapter 12 to be specific, that the Apostle James is martyred, beheaded by Herod in AD 44. External historical sources peg that date for us as the beginning of a major wave of persecution against the church at Jerusalem. So James the Apostle is gone a bit too early to have written the book of James. But there's another James that emerges. He sort of comes on the scene gradually. In Mark 3, Matthew 12, and Luke 8. All three of those chapters, Matthew 12, Mark 3, and Luke 8, include a moment in Jesus' early earthly ministry where his mother and brothers try to get to him in a crowd setting to dissuade his ministry. It's like mom and his brothers are trying to tamp down his ministry. And that leads to Jesus' discourse regarding, who is my mother, who are my brothers? But those who are following me as citizens in the kingdom of God. Interesting note, his father is not mentioned, which leads most of us to conclude that his earthly father, Joseph, has passed away by this time. But Mary and his brothers are seeking to dissuade his ministry. We learn later in Matthew 13 and Mark 6 that there are 4 half-brothers, and their names are James, who is the oldest of the half-brothers of Jesus. And you know why I'm saying half-brother, right? Same mom, way different dad. James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. We also learn, by the way, that he's got sisters in those same chapters, Matthew 13 and Mark 6. So the half-brothers of Jesus include the oldest half-brother of Jesus, a guy named James. They're hardly mentioned otherwise in the gospel, except John chapter 7, verse 5 mentions in passing that his brothers did not believe in him as Messiah. And that used to puzzle me. But if you grew up with an overachieving older sibling, an older sibling that always got everything right, at least in your family's grade book, so to speak, then you know that can create a little bit of resentment. Imagine growing up with Jesus as your older brother. Jesus never breaks curfew. Jesus' room is always perfectly clean. What's wrong with you? And I honestly believe that family dynamic and that resentment probably contributed to the fact that these guys didn't follow Jesus as Lord during his earthly ministry. However, in 1 Corinthians 15, specifically 1 Corinthians 15:7, within that catalog of post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, we learn in 1 Corinthians 15:7 that Jesus, after his resurrection, specifically appeared to and had a conversation with his oldest younger sibling, James. And further, we learn in Acts 1:14, when the church is gathered. Now the crucifixion has occurred, and more significantly even than that, as apologetic, the resurrection has occurred. Jesus by now has had that 1 Corinthians 15 appearance where he's had a conversation with James. And in the gathering of the early church in Acts chapter 1, we are told that Mary and the brothers of Jesus are a part of that gathering. So by Acts chapter 1, James, the oldest half-brother of Jesus, is there with the Jerusalem church. Also, by the way, his youngest half-brother, who is called Judas in the lists in the Gospels, but is said in Jude 1:1 to be the brother of James, humbly not the brother of Jesus. His youngest half-brother wrote the book of Jude. His oldest half-brother, an unbeliever until after the resurrection, actually wrote the book of James. We'll talk more in our next video about his leadership in the church at Jerusalem.